let's speak to Amnesty International Executive Director in Kenya, Irungu Houghton. Mr. Houghton, thank you very much for availing yourself this morning. What do we know about the circumstances of his passing? We understand that somebody has since been arrested.
Yes, I mean, I think the circumstances within which Edwin Chiloba's body was found has just been heartbreaking, and listening to the family and his friends and the LGBTIQ community, particularly across the country, really just gives us a sense of horror. So far, the criminal investigations are centering in on a suspect who was known to Edwin Chiloba and was a roommate and a friend, and therefore it seems to be heading in the direction that this could be not a hate crime, but it could be a matter of a relationship issue that developed between these two persons. But it's much too early to tell, and in many ways, as Amnesty International has investigated cases like this, and this case is being followed very closely by the National Lesbian and Gay Human Rights Commission, among others like Q Initiative. It's too early really to tell what the motives were and who may have been responsible for this heinous crime. But I think what we do have to point out is that homophobia is extremely rife in countries like Kenya. We still do not have legal protection for individuals that want to be involved in same-sex relationships. Same-sex marriage is outlawed, and homosexuality is stigmatized and very heavily penalized by some parts of the homophobic community in Kenya.
And Kenya is not the exception to the rule, particularly when we speak of the African continent. Yes. So what are some of the proposals on the table, right, from organizations like yourselves to change perceptions?
Yeah. So in cases like this, I think we have to make it very clear to the authorities, and in particular the police, that they must bring all their professionalism to this case, that they must secure the crime site, they must interview witnesses potentially, and also ensure that the justice is found for Edwin Chiloba. He was extremely popular. He was by all accounts a generous human being. He was somebody who was loved by his community, not just the LGBTI community, but the community in Eldoret, Uasin Gishu County, where he came from, and was very well known as a fashionista across social media. But I think the second thing really is to begin to address centuries of discrimination and stigma and prejudice against people who are different from others. And homophobia is one of those. We have seen large incidents or spikes of violence against women as well. This week we saw a horrible case of an infant whose eyes were gouged out, purely on the basis of potential dispute over land succession matters. So we have to address the fact that in violent societies, identity becomes one of the points upon which people can be victimized and really targeted. And that needs to stop, not just for the LGBTIQ community, but for all communities that are vulnerable.
It is often also said that, South Africa, you find so much violence, and as policy makers, researchers, etc., try to grapple on that, right, and understand why we're such a violent society. Why is Kenya such a violent society?
Well, 23, and this year we will mark the 60th anniversary of the victory over colonialism. Has centuries of discrimination and violence embedded in the colonial system, and it's also something that has not been addressed over the last 6 decades. And whereas we can point back to the historical roots of it, I think it's important that in this particular period that we actually take on issues like, for example, the idea that people have an entitlement over other people's bodies, that people can essentially body shame, that they can use revenge porn, that they can grope total strangers in public spaces. I mean, that's the beginnings, really, of the violence that we see across this country. And I think, the right to privacy, the right to bodily autonomy, the right to independent thought, the right to independent and safe relationships with others really is where we need to focus. So we have to address things like, for example, leering comments. We have to address issues like, stigma and attacks on people, even just verbal attacks. And where we see cases where, for example, consent has not been granted, particularly in terms of either date rape or even marital rape. We have to condemn this outright, because otherwise what we do is we open the door for the kind of violence that has been visited on Edwin Chiloba and, for that matter, on Sheila Lumumba, the lesbian woman who was killed almost a year ago now.
You spoke of the historical roots of the violence. I do wonder about the historical roots of the legal system in Kenya. Much has been said about decolonizing the legal system in many parts of the continent. And so when it comes to this anti-gay laws that the country has adopted, is it something that is drafted, adopted by Kenyans, or is this something that is inherited from the colonizers of Kenya?
No, I mean, the arc of our legal system is leaning towards equality. It's leaning towards diversity. It's leaning towards, respect for all persons. And Article 26 of the Constitution, passed in 2010, made it very clear that all human beings not only are born free, but that their lives really have to be an expression of that freedom and an extension of that freedom in all aspects. I mean, whether it be the freedom of expression, whether it be the freedom of choice, whether it be the freedom of relationships that we choose. But we still have colonial relics that sit on our statute books, and the two most heinous of those are Section 162 and Section 165 of our penal code, and they are essentially colonial statutes that essentially said that homosexuality is outlawed, and secondly, that any form of sex apart from intercourse is unlawful. And you can imagine what that means, not just to the LGBTI community, but to all people who are practicing sex in that sense. If it is only intercourse, the actual missionary position that is legalized in the Kenyan context, it probably means that our jails will be full of people who are exploring other forms of their sexuality.
Perhaps let's raise his name one more time. I think you alluded to it very briefly. Who is Edwin Chiloba?
So what we know about Edwin Chiloba was that he was a fashion designer. He was also a model. He was very active on social media, had thousands of followers, and was somebody who the LGBTI community felt was a leader in that space. I mean, that he was somebody who was able to generate creativity and expression, not just for LGBTIQ persons, but for Kenyans as a whole. He was son of the family that we listen to, and they live in a very populous part of the country called Uasin Gishu. It's a county, one of the 47, and in the town of Eldoret, a very urban, cosmopolitan city. It is amazing how his death has really made his name famous, and our Secretary General, Amnesty International Secretary General, Agnes Chalamad, also tweeted about this case yesterday. So it means that in different parts of the world, in the Global South and the Global South, his name is now known in many ways, much more than he was, sadly, 4 or 5 days ago. So we hope that this creates the pressure on the criminal justice system to make sure that we find out who it is that killed him, why they killed him, and have those people arraigned in a court of law so that they can get the justice that the system will provide for them.
Amnesty International Executive Director in Kenya, Irungu Houghton, thank you very much.